And see the stages of growth.
Yeah, that's fine. Will you be sitting in the audience? That's fine. Yes, I'm going to sit there because I wouldn't be able to see. Hey, hi Maureen, Professor Lewis. Good. Thanks for coming. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vereen Shepherd. I'm the director of the Center for Reparation Research. I'm here with my colleagues, Floyd Williams, who is the admin assistant, Jordan Quarry, the research assistant, who is at the back, tweeting, no doubt. And we're very happy to have you with us today, this afternoon, to listen to Professor Kris Manjapra, who shot to fame because he wrote to the British Treasury, Her Majesty's Treasury, to ask about the compensation loan and when was it paid off, and is it true it was only paid off in 2015, and so on and so on. But let me be more formal and read his bio for you. So, Kris Manjapra is Associate Professor of History at Tufts University and Chair of the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. He's the author of Age of Entanglement, German and Indian Intellectuals Across Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2014. He's also the author of M.N. Roy, Marxism and Colonial Cosmopolitanism, published by Routledge in 2010. He joined the Tufts University History Department in 2008 after completing his dissertation in the Harvard History Department in 2007 and a postdoctoral year at UCLA. As associate professor, he teaches courses on South Asia and globalization, comparative anti-colonialism, South Asian and modern European intellectual history, and post-colonialism. Manjapra's research is on South Asian and German history, and he is especially interested in transnational approaches. He's also co-director of the South Asia Digital Humanities Lab at Tufts, where he organizes the Corpora Multimedia Archiving Project that aims to create an indexed and federated repository of oral histories. He also, of course, in that repository, indexes lectures and other educational audiovisual materials across disciplines. He has served as the Director of Consortium of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, and the Director of Colonialism Studies at Tufts. He has also held fellowships from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, and also he has had an attachment at institutions in Berlin. So we've always wanted to have Kris here since 2015, and since we realized that the planter compensation money was only paid off in 2015, even as former Prime Minister Cameron came here to say forget slavery and move on as friends and promised us a prison. So I give you Kris Manjapra with his talk on emancipation processes as crimes against humanity. Let's welcome him.
Thank you very much, Professor Shepard. Maybe I can begin by locating myself, which is to say that I myself am from the Caribbean. I was born in Bahamas and grew up there before my family moved to Canada. And I had, I would say, a first phase of my research career was very focused on South Asia. I have some South Asian heritage, but interestingly, as I get to my middle age, somebody just said I look still pretty young, so that was good news. But I am definitely in middle age now, and I think it's my roots in the African diaspora that call me increasingly, and I find myself turning in some ways from the Indian Ocean to the Black Atlantic, and from questions of colonialism as they relate to South Asia to the ongoing questions of colonialism as they relate to the Caribbean, to the West Indies. That gives me a sense of a second life almost in my work, and so I'm pleased to be sharing a second life with you. So I'm going to read from a paper, and I'll read for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for question and answer. From a poet whose name is Lem Sissé. He's an African-British poet, contemporary, and just one stanza from his poem goes, "Who shall unlock the stocks and share, break the bond that bind unbound, lay bare the truth?" The British government, in a purported gesture of fiscal responsibility, redeemed 9 perpetual bonds in 2015 including government debt going back to the early 1700s. The most significant bond was raised in 1835 to pay slave owners the loss of their slaves during emancipation. Only in February 2018, in response to Freedom of Information Act requests that I submitted, did Her Majesty's Treasury announce that millions of living British taxpayers had, quote, helped end slavery through their taxes. A government loan of £15 million in 1835 was used to pay compensation to slave owners, and the British government redeemed that bond only 180 years later, paying annuities on this government loan for 180 years. As you may know, the British Treasury, in what they call their one of their Friday fact tweets, something that they tweet every Friday, on February 9th, 2018, they divulged the news to the British public, presenting the redemption of the Slavery Abolition Act loan in 2015 as a cause for national pride. But the tweet was subsequently deleted and silence followed. The British state's ongoing coupon payments on the Slavery Abolition Act bonds, the retraction of the Treasury's announcement, and the subsequent policy that they've adopted until now of no comment are tangible artifacts of the British state's disavowal of slavery's legacies in its post-imperial present. British disavowal is morally and historically anchored in its own national narrative of anti-slavery and abolition, and ideas about Britain's role as a peerless anti-slavery nation. And so when the news of these bonds resurfaces, it actually goes in some ways to the myth of a nation, not just a nation, of an empire. And no wonder in some ways why the disavowal is so extreme. And I can tell you, I'm going to read, as I mentioned, just sections of a paper, but there's some recent research that I was doing in London about 3 weeks ago, and I can catch you up to date and kind of where the current, research is around these slavery abolition bonds. I wanted to address a little bit of theory now, because I think it's important to what I want to say, and I want to talk a little bit about racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is the starting point for any study of British imperial emancipation that grasps its conditions and effects. Currently, historians of British Empire, such as the group associated with the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership, the LBS project at the University College London, they focus on British metropolitan individuals and families that received compensation for slave ownership. The LBS collective should certainly be acknowledged for its scholarly work to provide a comprehensive account of British slave owner compensation. But without a critical perspective anchored in the analysis of racial capitalism, the LBS collective remains largely fixed on the implications and what they call the legacies of slave ownership as they relate to domestic white British society. They overlook the racial capitalist relations in which these slave owners, like all imperial subjects, participated. Their economistic focus on tracing which Britons were compensated and how different British families passed down their slavery-derived wealth across generations ironically reinscribes a familiar British societal disavowal of the enduring imperial formations of anti-black racism. Lacking an investment in scholarly debates about racial capitalism, the LBS collective in London is inattentive to glaring questions about how emancipation produced new forms of racialization in Britain and its colonies. And in some ways, this is what this paper is seeking to do, which is to not consider emancipation as somehow a single event that had implications for Britain, but rather to study emancipation as a process that was ongoing. And when we look at that process, we actually see crimes against humanity in that very process that were being committed against black West Indians, people from the Caribbean. So hidden in some ways in emancipation, in the process of emancipation itself, was
a crime against humanity, even as slavery was obviously such a crime. And I'll explain, you'll see what I mean as I go. Scholarship on racial capitalism over the past 30 years shows that force, coercion, and appropriation and deadly elimination do not constitute a quote-unquote primitive or early phase of capitalism, but actually structure its ongoing operation. And furthermore, racial capitalism, as it's been framed by scholars such as Cedric Robinson, would point out that black bodies, black communities have been a target. Their evisceration, their elimination in particular, has been a target in the ongoing rise of capitalist economies. So this relationship between capitalism, race, and anti-blackness is something that I'm seeking to bring to the fore in this work. Achille Mbembe, the African philosopher, developed the concept of what he calls necro politics, discussing racial slavery as an originary logic with its archetypal sites on the slave ship, the prison, and the plantation. Racial slavery brought about terror, natal alienation, and social death, especially targeting the African diaspora through the transatlantic trade. Mbembe describes other necropolitical logics in which he seeks to create a kind of constellation, thinking also about apartheid in Africa, or partition across all of Africa, or forms of genocide against indigenous and native peoples. Here, death-making and the ability to keep conquered, incarcerated, or occupied peoples in what he calls a state of injury becomes, for the capitalist order, a way to produce value. I'll just read that again. Here, death-making and the ability to keep conquered, incarcerated, and occupied peoples in the state of injury becomes, in themselves, productive of value. Mbembe points out that the materialist and political economic understanding of value production fails to illuminate the almost ritualistic ways in which the destruction of black life becomes a source of superabundance, of surplus for capitalist orders. It is that relationship that I find we need to understand in order to figure out how it's possible that that the financing of emancipation has a 180-year-long life, and of course, its life is still ongoing. So let me now turn to some more concrete matters for the rest of my presentation. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was, I'm not going to go into great detail into the act itself. I want to talk about the process in which emancipation happened, and also the financial implications of this act. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was in fact the equivalent of a great financial stimulus program for the British Empire. It, you might say, was a distant predecessor of Keynesian interventionism of the 1930s. It was a great bailout. It was a great bailout not just of particular slave owners, but really of a whole economic order that was in transformation, an imperial economic order. The compensation of slave owners happened at a time when the regnant worldview of the British imperial order was changing from an old system based on Westphalian mercantilism, monopoly, and custom, to a new one based on Smithian open markets, comparative advantage, competition, and contract. This is a huge structural change. In other words, a centuries-old British imperial socioeconomic regime was coming to an end in the 1830s, and the pouring of liquidity into British imperial markets allowed for reinvestment and relocation of finance capital out of a declining economic order and into new industrial and infrastructural ventures that would characterize the new phase of the British world economy. And it's in this context that we can understand the interests of compensated emancipation as not just relating to how to compensate slave owners, but how to bail out a whole imperial economic order. And again, this helps us to kind of begin reckoning with the history of these slave owner bonds. So I will spend some time now, before I talk about the bonds, talking about the emancipation process. Because the emancipation process was itself a financial process. Apprentices were officially subjected to an intricate schedule of punishments for different grades of non-compliance with the labor requirements and stipulations against vagrancy. So apprentices were the category in which those who were enslaved were transferred between 1833 and 1838. They became apprentices to freedom, apprentices to their own freedom. Before, in 1838, they were fully emancipated. So these 5 years from 1833 to 38 saw a whole new set of punishments being imposed on the apprentices, those who were being called apprentices. This included fines, extra labor, incarceration in plantation dungeons, or in parish workhouses. Children 6 or older now had to labor in the fields after having been exempted from this requirement during the amelioration period from 1823 to 1832. Apprentices were precluded from buying land or moving to another part of the colony without a passport and the written consent of their masters. They were banned from seeking other employment without the master's permission. So in order to free the enslaved, they were in fact put into a 6-year-long period that was, in essence, slavery itself. Before going on, let me just point out that the compensated emancipation model of what Britain is doing, what I'm going to describe to you that Britain is doing, and they replicate it with differences in their own context. And so we can see that this question about the compensation and how it happens for abolition and emancipation is also not just a British imperial question, because it set the template that came to be replicated across, you might say, across the whole of the other European empires. Okay, now let's turn to looking at the process itself. So there were different financial devices that were used on the ground about 1841. We have cash and sometimes stock being paid to slave owners in London. How was the amount for their compensation calculated? The cash compensation that the government would pay to slave owners was intended to supposedly capture the asset value of black enslaved people and to relocate this value to other parts of the British Empire. One device that was used to do this was called the valuation form. A valuation form was used to account for the number of slaves on each plantation and to appraise the quality of slave, quote-unquote, slave property. The form was the basis for determining the compensation claims of slave owners, and the value of enslaved people was determined by the Central Commission of Arbitration sitting in London and a group of assistant commissioners in the plantation colonies. Of the 7 members of the Central Commission, 3/4 of the salaried members were themselves slave owners, and the majority of the assistant commissioners in the colonies were planters, attorneys, and merchants ensconced in the slave economy. The fundamental procedures of slave owner compensation were orchestrated by slave owners for slave owners. So many of you may know these details. I won't go into, I'll just mention this very briefly before we talk about what I think is perhaps something that's perhaps less known. So we all may know in this room that, in fact, these valuation records, these valuation forms, used particular categories to designate the quote-unquote quality of apprenticed enslaved people, whether they be pradial or whether they be pradial unattached or non-pradial, or even children or disabled. And according to these different categories, a different price would be allocated for that soul, for that enslaved person. And this would then be summed over the course of the valuation report, and that would be the way that a slave owner's compensation would have been calculated on the ground. There were these 5 divisions in which the enslaved were categorized as well in terms of their level of skill. Either they were head people or tradesmen or inferior tradesmen or field laborers or inferior field laborers. And these were part of the measurements or the calculations that were used to quote-unquote calibrate the quality and the value of the slave property. So that is something that is, of course, well known. But if we look carefully at the actuarial procedures, we see that slave owners actually received compensation for enslaved persons who had run away or who were long absent from the fields, and sometimes who had already been manumitted, but they even received compensation for enslaved people who were registered as dead. And this, for me, is I did not realize how extensive this practice was, the compensation for dead souls, and that's what I want to describe now. And this is also why when we talk about compensation for slave owners and the fact that the compensation was paid through a loan and the loan was only finally redeemed 3 years ago, we're talking about a loan that itself supports crimes against humanity. And so how could a government continue to pay that loan and today not even acknowledge that what it was paying for, and in the only tweet that it provided to celebrate itself for what it had done, when we actually look at what happened, we see these kinds of crimes taking place. So this is what I would like to describe next. And this report is part of the evidence. This is from James Roberts, and this is exactly the process. This is exactly what he was doing. He was getting money for a slave that an enslaved person that he claiming to have died 4 years previously. So in other words, the actuarial recordings of slave valuers extracted surplus from what I'm calling the vibrancy of dead and absent racialized human beings. The valuation process was a pursuit in grave digging, carried out using financial instruments and the money form. The practice of claiming dead and absentee slaves was widespread across the 19 plantation colonies. A variety of authorizing and validating technologies were employed alongside the valuers' accounting forms, including affidavits, attestations, oaths, declarations, examinations, and authentications that were used in order to give legitimacy to the claims of slave owners when they went to the attorneys and declared that they had a certain number of slaves who had either disappeared or died for whom they wished their compensation. Assistant commissioners often modified the valuation forms with their own handwriting marginalia as they bent and twisted its logic to take maximum advantage of the value of absent or dead enslaved souls. Reading through the valuation reports, which I was doing while at the National Archives in London, for all 19 plantation colonies, shows widespread accounting practices that rewarded slave owners for the price of slaves who had run away or marooned long ago. These scribal practices were most widespread, actually, in Jamaica overall, in Trinidad, and in Mauritius, where we might say runaway, the practice of marronage or running away to the hills was especially rampant. In fact, the Jamaican parishes where the value of absent slaves was most monetized were in St. Elizabeth, St. Thomas, St. Anne, Manchester, St. Mary, St. Thomas in the Vale, and Clarendon. The very parishes with relatively large vacant lands and relatively unsurveillable terrain. Valuers used different designations, creating a spectrum of categories for the absent enslaved. Sometimes they were labeled as maroons, for which slave owners received their money, or as runaways, or as defectors, or deserters, or as, quote, the absent, or as the non-present. And then use of these different categories reached its height in Guyana, where assistant commissioners actually developed a numbering system to designate the kinds of absent slaves. They used the number 1 for absent slaves with value and the number 2 for absent slaves without value. So again here, the ways in which these recording practices, when we're thinking about what this means in terms of human beings, counts, I would argue, as a slow motion crime against humanity. Valuers, as part of their practice, had the habit of conjuring the present monetized value of absent slaves through these kinds of inscriptions. A valuation return from Clarendon, Jamaica, for example, included the price for a runaway enslaved person last seen on the plantation back in 1904. Okay, so this was happening in 1835, and what's recorded on this form is a slave owner receiving compensation for an enslaved person who he had last seen in 1804, 30 years ago. At that point in 1804, when that person was 5 years old. In Kingston, a slave owner received compensation for an 11-year-old child who had been absent from the plantation since the age of 3. Many times it was presumed that absent slaves were still alive and had fled to maroon communities, but there is also no evidence to the contrary. But other times, absent slaves were either rumored or even known to be dead. In either case, slave value was credited to the account of the slave owners. There was never any judicial process or any investigative process to figure out, for example, how the enslaved came to be absent, or under what conditions they came to be dead. One return from Kingston, Jamaica reads, quote, "She would have been 17 in 1819. It is unknown if she is still alive today," unquote. In St. Andrews, Jamaica, a valuer inscribed the note, quote, "8-year-old boy who would be 25 in 1834, doubtful he is alive," unquote. Again, for that affidavit, for that note written on that affidavit form, the slave owner received money. And the money was paid for with this loan that the government was paying for 180 years until 3 years ago. The dead body was, this dead boy was priced as an adult male slave in order to credit the slave owner as much as possible, to give him as much money as possible. And his value was entered into the valuation report and eventually transferred as cash into the hands of his master. In some cases, prices of absent slaves were subtracted from slave owner accounts, but the accounting for the vibrancy of absent or dead black people on the plantations, whether through operations of addition or subtraction, was underpinned by the view that the essence of an enslaved person was the market price associated with their body matter, not with their human life. The slave, in the emancipation process, not just under slavery, but the slave in the emancipation process, this is my point, in order to supposedly be made free, was actually radically eviscerated of their value as human beings. This is a paradox of what the process of emancipation was. It reenacted the same kind of dehumanization and genocide in a certain way as slavery itself. Sometimes the actually existing and intensely intimate social bonds between slave owners and the enslaved even spilled out onto the valuation form. From Cape Town, we read of what he's labeled as a boy of 53 years old, who runs away in 1833 and whose value is captured on his slave owner's form because he had previously been, quote, a good servant. And we also read of a enslaved woman, age 42, who, quote, accompanies her master to England in 1835. The slave owner got paid for the enslaved woman's ascribed financial value, and he put that money in his back pocket, even as he also enjoyed the property of her mind, her personality, and her flesh. A vivid example of the valuation of not just absent but dead slaves is offered by the return of James Roberts of Montego Bay, Jamaica. A dead enslaved man named Philip was converted into monetary value of 15 pounds through inscription on Roberts' valuation form. I don't know if you can see. So you see there the name at the top, James Roberts.
Does the infrared thing work? It's not. Yeah, there we go.
So you see here James Roberts, Montego Bay. There's one soul, well, I'm saying soul, for they would have said one piece of property. A non-pradial enslaved man named Philip, and that's on the other side of the sheet, which you'll see in a moment. Philip reportedly died in 1837. The following year, his owner, James Roberts, signed an affidavit. I can show you the affidavit. It's on. This is the language of the affidavit. Signed an affidavit, quote, being duly sworn that the dead soul of Philip belonged to him date of emancipation on August 1st, 1834. Philip is one of the many vibrant enslaved dead people who appear by name in the valuation reports. Philip's value is in some ways confected or fabulated and recorded on the valuer's form in money terms. Ironically, the names of living and present slaves were not included in the majority of the thousands of pages of valuation reports. Ironically, it was only the names of the dead slaves who were recorded. It is as though the barest trace of slave or apprentice personhood, their name, appears in these documents only where a black life has been obliterated or where the actual physical whereabouts of a black person could no longer be known. If what some theorists called biopower seeks to record and manage the living, this is a different kind of power, going back to Michel Mbembe's thought. This we can call necropower, which seeks to record and manage the living dead. Robert's affidavit, which is this language here, says, quote, I'll read the whole thing, from Jamaica, St. James, it says, James Roberts of the parish and island, the aforesaid gentleman, being duly sworn, disposeth and saith that the apprentice named Philip, in quotes, comprised in the annexed island registrar certificate of the registration of 2 slaves by deponent in the year 1823, was a slave in the possession of deponent to the 1st of August 1834, and from thenceforward an apprentice to him in the last year 1837, when the said apprentice named quote-unquote Philip died. The deponent is included by and with the advice and consent of the recently appointed valuers, Messrs. George Gordon and Thomas Rayburn, to testify an oath to the truth of the contents of this affidavit. Signed, James Roberts. Sworn to before me, this 7th day of February 1838, H.M. Plummer. Robert's valuation is anomalous, as it was completed in 1838. Across all the plantation colonies, almost all valuations were completed by 1835. The archive gives us no information as to why Roberts received special treatment. The yellowing archival documents, with their smell of dust and mildew, reminiscent of the redolence of sweat and tobacco, do not tell us what happened to Philip and how he died. The document doesn't ask. The commissioner didn't ask. It wasn't material to the transaction that this document attests to. We do not know anything of Robert's role in his death, whether it was through deprivation or negligence or abuse or mortal assault. The mind overflows with a cascade of questions when confronted with documents like this, and there are so many of them in the archive at the National Archive. I mean, just going through so many of these is a physical experience of being made to feel unwell. When confronted with all of these valuation reports for the dead souls. How did Philip die? How old was he? What did he look like? How long was he on the run? Was he on the run? What did his friends feel when they touched his hand or arms or embraced him? Did he die alone, only to be found later? What was his mother's name? Who were his siblings? The archive provides us no direct answers. This actuarial paper reduces Philip to a debt claim for a dead soul paid by the British state to a man whom the state recognized as his owner. It is a gruesome experience to sit, as I was saying, in the National Archives in the United Kingdom, to turn these pages of dusty archival documents reeking of mildew and negligence and racial terrorization, as 800,000 black people were transformed into 20 million pounds of financial value and distributed to more than 44,441 slave-owning claimants. And the ready cash to carry out this transubstantiation of black life, living, absent, and dead, into money, occurred through the raising of a massive loan by the British government in 1835, and the British state continued to pay for almost 2 centuries, ending only in our time. So now let me talk about the financial instruments that are behind the bonds for financing this crime against humanity that I was just telling you about. On July 29, 1835, the government, represented by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Thomas Spring Rice, convened a meeting of potential bidders to provide the 15 million pounds that would be needed in order to pay cash to slave owners like eventually James Roberts. This was a group of the most powerful banking houses of the City of London, and many of them would also be beneficiaries of slave compensation to boot. Among the 30 men were the most powerful London bankers, the Rothschilds, the Barings, the Irvings, and the Reeds. The next day, Baring Brothers and Company and Reed Irving and Company withdrew, and they refused to offer a bid. After all, 15 million pounds back in that day was an astronomical amount. It was 40% of the gross domestic product of Britain, which, if we were to calculate that today, would be $200 billion. That would be the equivalent, if we were to find the equivalent in terms of gross domestic product percentage. So this is an astronomical amount of money. U.S. dollar. That was U.S. Sorry, that was pounds. What I was saying, 200 billion pounds. A day later, under unclear circumstances, all the other parties withdrew, leaving only one bidder, the Rothschilds, the Rothschild Syndicate. The Rothschilds bought bonds at a discount. So there were a lot of machinations that were at work that help us explain why the Rothschilds ended up providing this 15 million pounds. First of all, they ended up not providing the full 15 million. They provided 14,700,000 and some, because they were allowed to buy at a discount. The Rothschilds bought bonds at a discount at an interest rate of a very high interest rate for the time of £3.09, which equals about a 3.48% interest rate, which was below par, which was below the par value of the time. Not to get so complicated, to boil this down, it means that they could buy these bonds for cheap and they could sell them for a higher price on the bond markets, on the secondary bond market. So they were obtaining bonds that they would then sell on secondary markets, and they would receive a profit for that procedure. In addition, the Rothschilds received the benefit of additional short-term annuities worth a total present value of £101,875. Basically, the government was sweetening the pot, so it also gave them additional annuities. The government sweetened the pot even further by offering the Rothschilds a 2% discount for providing cash up front in a single installment. They received the discount, but they did not provide the cash up front. It actually took them a whole year to provide the full amount. So this all amounted to a significant financial profit for the Rothschilds Bank. But the profiting, let us not forget, was made possible and had its condition for possibility based on racial capitalism, based on this way of targeting, destroying, eliminating, eviscerating black bodies in order to produce monetary value for the pockets of metropolitan and also West Indian slave holders. The debt from the Rothschild loan was resold on bond markets for, okay, let me just pause here and show you what this is. So I was just in Britain a couple weeks ago. I continue to look for evidence of these financial, which is at the National Archives in the National Debt Office files. And here you see this was the final amount that the government received from the Rothschilds. It's 14,771,000 and some. And that is recorded here. It's less than the 15 million. Furthermore, this document shows, I was making a note of this earlier, that the Rothschilds took made 130 separate deposits between September 16th, 1835 and August 17th, 1836 in order to provide that full amount to the government. However, because the government needed more money than what the Rothschilds eventually gave them, the government eventually, starting on June 29th, started allocating a portion of the... Yes?
Could you just repeat those dates, September to August?
September 16th, 1835 to August 17th, 1836. Yes, exactly. Yes. So because the government needed to supplement this, they began supplementing it with what was called the Consolidated, they began what was called the Consolidated Fund. And I'm still trying to figure out what all of these machinations were, but the government had to come in with additional money in order to top up, because the compensation was more than what they had received from the Rothschilds. And this is, in some ways, what we see taking place here. You see, this is the amount that they had in their account, and this is the ledger of payments that were being made for the compensation fund. And here you see 14,771,000. Here, the compensation amount that they were paying out was already up to 15 million and some. So they had to make up that difference, and there were a variety of ways that they were making it up, which I'm still trying to figure out. Right. Okay. So the debt from the Rothschild loan, as I mentioned, was resold on bond markets. And my sense is that the Rothschilds bought and sold pretty quick because that represented profit for them. They were buying low and they could sell it high. Ultimately, and this is what we find out from Freedom of Information Act requests submitted last year, that I submitted last year, and this is what I heard from the Treasury, ultimately, when these bonds, which were born in 1835, were finally redeemed in 2015, there were 11,098 different accounts that had been that received both annuities and redemption. All of those accounts shared part of the total redemption value for these bonds, which the redemption value alone, this is not when you add up all the annuities that were being paid over time, the redemption value alone in 2015 was £218,388,715 in February 2015. A Freedom of Information Act request sent to Her Majesty's Treasury shows that the largest 20 of these accounts received 80% of the total value. And almost all of these accounts belonged to large financial institutions by the time that we come to 2015. However, one of these 20 accounts belonged to a single individual, although the Treasury will not release that person's name. And so when I tell friends in London about this, they wonder whether the largest institution is the Church of England and the largest holding individual happened to be the Queen. I mean, is that what we're talking about here? The historical guilt for these, they're called gilt-edged bonds, these kinds of long-term bonds, has been transferred across the British public debt accounts for almost 2 centuries. The UK government has paid tens of millions of pounds in annuities on the original principal of 15 million to a host of undisclosed beneficiaries. The bonds of the Slavery Abolition Act loan were set on the template of what were called gilt-edged consols, a particular debt instrument that was invented in 1752. They were converted, and so now I'm going to just tell you what happens from 1835 to 2015 as best as we know now, or as best as I know now. They were converted into, so these bonds which were sold in 1835, these were reconsolidated into a new kind of bond in 1888 after the National Debt Conversion Act under the directorship of George Goschen. The government debt from the Slavery Abolition Act loan was in 1888 repackaged or converted with other debt and reissued at a lower interest rate, at a new bond with an interest rate of 2.75%. Remember that the original bonds of 1835 were issued at about a 4% interest rate. A 3.5 interest rate. In 1927, the British government again reconsolidates the bonds, again with other long-term government debt, including now loans that went into funding the response to the Irish famine in 1847, the Crimean War, and the First World War. And so part of what we might see happening is the way that the government is kind of washing the Abolition Act bonds over time by mixing it with other debt streams, by reconsolidating and repackaging bonds so that a sliver of each bond in some ways is coming from the Slavery Abolition Act loan, but not the total amount. We can see that as almost a way of trying to drown the story in through these reconsolidations. Now, it's important to note and reflect on the fact that many states in the world since the late 18th century have in fact repudiated bonds, especially bonds or debt that relates to crimes against humanity. That is actually not an uncommon practice, especially what came to be codified as odious debt. So odious debt is something that, especially by the end of the 19th century, many governments, including the United States and France, would reject, calling such debt illegitimate and immoral. In the United States and in France, after their respective revolutions, they repudiated the debts of their old regimes. The Mexican Republic in 1867 repudiated the debts associated with the period of French occupation. The Soviet Republic repudiated the debts of the imperial regime in 1918. So why is it that the British Empire did not repudiate its debts that funded the crimes against humanity that I was describing of emancipation itself, in the way that they carried out emancipation? Government repudiation of old odious debt is a moral statement and insists on the government taking a moral stance. And obviously, Britain has not just not taken that moral stance, but it continues to hope that the problem will simply go away. However, how can we overlook the fact that the British state was paying more than £550,000 per year in coupon payments to the creditors of the West India loan over the course of 180 years? And furthermore, what are the implications of that at a financial level for the Caribbean? We know, for example, that within British public discourse, the Caribbean, beginning in the 1840s already, we can look at the writing of Thomas Carlyle, was often presented as a kind of deadweight, or as a source of ruin, as a kind of drain on British national accounts, when in fact the reality was completely the opposite. The fact is that the British government went into this huge debt in order to pay its slave owners. And the question that I'm trying to figure out is, now that the British had this huge debt, how did they force their West Indian colonies to pay for it? What are the different ways that they began extracting wealth from the British colony, from the British West Indian colonies especially, in order to fund or to float their ongoing debt payments? Okay. So that's the story that I wanted to share. It related to the compensation for dead souls. It related to the history of these slave bonds, the financial history of the slave bonds. And let me just close by showing you some images from, again, this is from my last trip. I didn't go through all of these, but these are these different, you can talk about that, these different instruments. Or maybe I didn't put them up. Let's see what I have here. Oh, this is what I wanted to show. Okay, so this is one image I wanted to show. This also goes back to 1835. Very faintly written, it says 15 million pounds. It says loan, 15 million pounds. Now, I found this at the Bank of England archives, and it has no official name. But my sense is that this is the list of incoming money from the Rothschilds. I think that's what this document is, showing how the money came into the compensation account. I believe that's what that document is, although there's no title. So another question is, why is it so hard to find the documents around what was happening with these finances? I continue to be very surprised by that. And then finally, this was also at the Bank of England archives. This is the 1927 4% consolidated loan that the Slavery Abolition Act loan was reconsolidated into or mixed into in 1927. So there was a mixing that happened in 1888, there was a mixing that happened in 1927, and it was this instrument that was finally redeemed in 2015, and it was through the redemption of this consolidated loan that the history of this long debt stream in terms of funding the slave owners finally came to, in some ways, its official end. So my last word would be, I think part of why this is important is because it shows that on a financial level, forget about the moral and the ethical, and we don't even have to go into that, although I think that is the most important. But we don't have to go into the realm of the ethical and the moral. We can just stick with the financial. If you look at the finances, the history of the end of slavery did not end in 1835. It has not ended. I mean, it goes on in a variety of ways. And you can especially see that if we track the number of income streams that were created during emancipation. So emancipation, sure, it put cash into the pockets of slave owners, but it also created all of these new income streams, these credit streams. And I've just described one. In fact, when you look at the compensation that was happening in Mauritius and in the Cape Colony and in Barbados, we see that the government was paying slave owners with stocks. How long were those stocks paid? How long was interest or annuities on those stocks being received? That's a story that went much longer than 1840 or 1845. And so it's interesting that the moral and the ethical dimension, but in another realm, the financial dimension, is where we need to look in order to make clear the material history of the legacies of racial capitalism and slavery, and to reiterate with what we all know, but what in some ways a supremacist or white supremacist racial order insists upon, and it's a racial order that permeates our world, which is that supposedly the past is the past. And now that we're 180 years on, shouldn't we just forget and thank you, and move on, right? So how can we move on? Which is what Cameron said when I believe he came to Jamaica. It's time to move on. How can we move on when these debt legacies are still alive, right? So I think that for me is kind of a hook to connect the financial and the ethical. I'll just end with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kris. And the floor is now open for about half an hour for questions and answers by Kris. Perhaps I'll take them in blocks. So who will start? All right, so I see April, Michael, Rupert, and Moji. Good. So in that order. April?
Sorry, I wish I could listen to everything you said again, but can you repeat what the tweet said when they said they had finished?
Sure. The tweet said,
Friday fact. That was the first thing.
a
fun Friday fact.
A fun Friday fact. I wish we could find the tweet. They said that Her Majesty's Treasury announced that millions of living British taxpayers, quote, had helped end slavery through their taxes. And there's more. It's an actually really interesting tweet, which is online. You can just search for it. But that was the celebration that for 180 years, in fact, British taxpayers have been helping to end slavery. Right? That was the way that it was framed.
They said slavery instead of what they really meant. Actually.
They said the slave trade.
Yes.
And they meant slavery. Yes. So they were confusing the end of both the slave trade and slavery as well. There was a very confused. Yeah.
Okay,
tweet.
So you got your answer in a way. Michael?
Two issues, Professor Manjapra.
Yes.
Yeah. The first one is the whole issue of the compensation to the slave masters, slave owners. The more we get, the more information we get is the more interesting. So obviously, the taxpayers are now aware that they've contributed to paying the slave masters, the slave owners. And I think that opens up the discussions. Well, now you've paid the slave masters, slave owners. You should be quite happy paying the enslaved themselves. So that opens the door to me. It's the Trojan horse. You paid them, now this is outstanding debt to the actual enslaved. From a purely financial point of view, what's right is right, what's fair is fair. Mm-hmm. And you could argue at least the same amount, if not more. Mm-hmm. So that's not even taking the purely moral perspective. But the other thing I'm interested in now, looking at the paper trail or the financial trail, you mentioned this Rothschild syndicate as a major buyer of the bonds and so forth. And I'm just wondering, in fact, if apart from them, who else is being paid by the taxpayers? I mean, who else has profited from this bond, the floating of bonds and stuff like that? I mean, how many more groups can we isolate? And can this Rothschild syndicate be held culpable for participating in, basically dirty money themselves?
Hold that, Kris.
Yes. Thanks very much for your presentation. I wanted to know the comparison between the French, Dutch, American, and British compensation, and also to link that with the theoretical approach that you started out with, which is theorizing racial capitalism. I think that there is the scope of the compensation packages to the major architects of capitalism within Europe and the United States poses some critical questions with respect not simply to reparations, not only to reparations, but to the nature of capitalism and black oppression. Right? So that's an issue which needs to be discussed alongside reparation. I understand the focus on reparation and support of it, but the critique of capitalism itself needs to be a part of the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and in this round, finally, Moji.
It's a simple question. Just was there a stated rationale for paying the slave owners for dead people?
Okay, so we have, well, April already got it. Before the 4th? Okay, but I'll take you first in the second round. So you have your answer, Michael's question, and Rupert, and then Moji, and then we'll take you the second round.
Sure.
My apologies.
Okay, thank you. So, in terms of what this opens up, I think in terms of reparations, I agree that the material proof that, in fact, if you like, a compensation has been paid for generations to slave owners, begs the question: well, then, what about the enslaved and the generations of their ancestors, their descendants? So I that as another, another important line of discussion. And not just discussion; it's more political than discussion. It's holding British politicians and also the British public discourse to account. And it's interesting to think of the different ways that can be done. I mean, another argument here would be: what is the implication for making Black Britons pay through their taxes, which they've been doing, for this compensation for 180 years? Like, how does that get addressed, right? So that's another issue. It's interesting, though, to look at how difficult it seems currently to get a political discussion to take place around this topic. I can just report anecdotally that when I was in London, I did speak to a lawyers group, kind of civic-minded lawyers group, and they were initially quite enthusiastic about moving forward, but either somebody high up in their organization spoke with somebody who's a friend in the government, and all of a sudden it's not possible. Similarly, when I speak to British historians, I get a certain, the first response is real, oh, you're kidding me, that's something we need to look into. And I'm not surprising, after about a week, I don't know who they've spoken to, but it goes cold. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in what is happening behind the scenes, and how is, in fact, the British imperial state structured through relations that are maybe informal relations, or relations between a small ruling group that allow for this denial to continue, and even though it's in plain sight. So I'm curious, and I'm also therefore curious to know how, in fact, a player that is not limited by that logic, like the CARICOM Reparations Commission, could actually play a different kind of role. So that I think is interesting. I'd like to learn about that. In terms of the comparative discussion, I am not an expert. I'll just say that at first. It is a theme that I'm very interested in exploring further. We know that there are generally two different forms of processes of emancipation. One which is called gradual emancipation, the other one is called compensated emancipation, and many times there are overlaps. And in the American case, they began in the 1770s with a gradual emancipation, i.e. Slave owners did not get cash, but they got claim or title to the labor of their enslaved folk for a period of time, which was to be their payment. and then they were eventually emancipated. Versus what the British invented in 1830. This was an invention of giving cash in order to wind things down. And I would argue it's not just about how to get out of the property, the title to chattel property, but I think it was also a huge, like I was saying, a huge form of financial stimulus that the government was kind of a pre-Keynesian stimulus. So given that this was the template, I think another now line of research would need to look in detail at how it relates to, in comparative terms, what was happening in the Dutch and the French and the Danish and in Brazil and in Spanish America. And I would like to explore that further. But even without getting into those details, I think we can take a big step back and see that every single emancipation that happened in the 19th century was either gradual or compensated, and the majority, in fact, were compensated. And so what was the end of slavery about? Was it primarily about abolitionism? You know, like Drescher would argue, it's, you know, kind of Enlightenment ideas, and you have these people who want to do the right thing. Or is it more, if you look at it through Eric Williams' lens, is it that slavery simply crumbled away and free markets emerged, and it was almost like an infrastructural change that was taking place? Or was there a deliberate project that was at work in order, on the backs, literally on the backs and through the bodies, the destruction of the bodies of black people, in order to generate these huge stimulus packages in the 19th century to begin to really kickstart the liberal economic order? I think that is actually very probable, and it does make us have to ask questions about how liberal economies, which date their life in some ways back to this very time, to the 1800s, early 1800s, were actually born through through the destruction of black lives, and continue to, in fact. And I don't think that was just a kind of birth pang. I think that becomes then also structural to how capitalism works. So I just want to echo what you're saying, that I think we should not just think of how to seek justice within, the economic system. In some ways, reparations is that. But there is really, I think, an opportunity to think about the racialized infrastructure of the system itself, and what does that then impel us to demand, right? So I resonate with both of those points.
The question, I'm coming to you, Moji, on the dead.
Yes, and
the dead souls.
I tend to be very long-winded in my comments. Sorry about that. I'll be shorter. The dead souls, it's funny. It's not. It is not reflected upon in any of the documents that I saw that they were actually paying slave owners for dead souls. It doesn't rise to the level of self-reflection within the system. It simply was a practice, and in fact, it was a practice that differed in different places. So it was a bit informal in that it happened in some parishes and not in others. In some parishes, dead souls were subtracted. In some, they were added. It wasn't as if there was a overview to it, and that's, I think, very interesting.
Okay, so we start with you in the second round. Is there another?
Rob, the thing about the Rothschild syndicate never got answered. I think it was overlooked.
The Rothschild, very briefly, the Rothschild. So it was Nathan Rothschild, who was the head of the house in London, and his nephew Montefiore, who was, as I mentioned, his nephew. They were the London branch. There was a Paris branch, there was a German branch, there was an Austrian branch. This constituted the Rothschild syndicate. And the money was pooled from these different hubs. That's how they could create the 15 million. I intend to ask the Rothschilds about this, because they're still very much around. Yeah.
Okay. All right, your question, yes.
Something very basic for clarity, because I really don't understand. Although I appreciate your overall presentation. It's about the repudiation. All right, just correct me. the British, the government borrowed the money from the, like the equivalent of the private sector. No, with the intention of paying back the private sector, call it that. No, you're asking them to repudiate the thing. It's not that. No, my understanding of repudiation is that if you owe me something, I could forgive it. But if I owe you, and I'll pour over it to repudiate it as easy because it's I who owe you. The thing. So I just don't, I'm not saying you're not incorrect, you know, but I just don't understand how that would work. Since I owe you, then how are you going to repudiate what I owe to you?
Right.
Okay.
So can you explain that?
Yeah, hold that point. Next question? Yes. Yes, your turn.
Oh, all right. I wanted to ask, it's following up on the payment for the dead souls. Right. I wanted to ask the question as to whether or not there could be some overlap in the types of compensations that were paid. And I ask this because the British kept a very firm accounting of the slave population between 1813 and 1834 through the vast registries. If we look at these are 127 volumes. And every 3 years they were returned. You could count up every single slave for which compensation was due. Perhaps with the exception of British Honduras and Cayman, who only reported in 1834. All of the others had 4, 5, 6 triennial returns. So we know those numbers. And everybody stopped in 1834, with the exception of Mauritius, which is not a part of the British Caribbean, in 1835. Now you have people claiming dead souls up to 1837. And what I wanted to know is whether or not there is some conflation of what the British government was paying with what insurance companies were probably paying for dead souls, or property which were insured, which went up until the 1840s.
That's a great question.
I believe including the Zion song, where they killed how many, throwing them overboard, and got compensation for all of them because they were dead. Right, so I wanted to know if there's a conflation there between what the British were paying for compensation for property through emancipation and insurance company Lloyd's of England for dead people. And secondly, my next question is Frederique Beauvoir. You might have heard her book.
Yes.
2016.
Yeah,
wrote about this debate.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth reading because she goes through the very different paradigms for which compensation was paid. Legally for eminent domain, socially and economically for aid, and politically to ensure cooperation of the colonies, because these slave owners had votes and they could vote in England. They owned land in England and they could affect government in England. So she uses all of these arguments to show situations and contexts for which compensation continued to be paid and for which this kind of cooperation worked. So I think these are contexts that should be considered, because I think France had the same thing going with England. I think they just finished 2 years ago, right, as the British did as well. So yeah, so this is what I wanted to say. There might be a conflation in the compensation, one, and two, the various contexts for which compensation sustained itself over 150 years.
Interesting, because I had that very question about how do you match the two. In terms of the registration of slaves, and also adding the dead ones. Yes, that's right.
Because they became mixed
That's
up.
right. But just a correction though. The second trial by Mansfield did not award the compensation to the insurers for the 132 on the song. So
The
and it was
compensation went to whom exactly?
no, they lost the case. There was supposed to be a retrial. It never happened. But even though Mansfield was not too sympathetic of the idea of people having been drowned or massacred, he did not rule
for the slave owner.
The first trial did, and then there was a retrial because
they lost.
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, is there another hand before? Okay, so one last question in this round, and then Kris, your short answers. Go ahead.
Ricardo.
Yes, Ricardo.
I don't know if you have this type of data, but the dollar ratio between the valuation claims and the overall industrial claims, or the overall industrial returns that they would get back from, that the British would get back from slave production, the work product of the slaves. Is there a dollar ratio between, I'm specifically asking, is the valuation claims valued more than the dollar value that the slave was, the slave work product?
The slaves were valued according to skill level.
Right, I understand, no, but I'm saying is, right,
Did they overvalue them to claim the compensation?
Right, for instance, the sum,
yes,
those insurance claims to, how you say, remunerate these laborers, did that money from these valuations, what is the level? Is there a balance between that level of the valuation claims and then the money that the countries, the industrial intake that they're getting from the work product of the slave? Is there any reflection between the two?
Okay, so we have 3 questions, 3 quick answers.
3 quick answers.
And I think we'll only have time for maybe one more round.
Okay, so quick answers to the first on, sovereign debt. So the government is a different kind of borrower than any other borrower. And because it is a special borrower, a sovereign borrower, in some ways it has an option that no other borrower has, which is, if it should choose, it can claim odious debt and repudiate various debts that it has, which as a sovereign it may do. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean the people who have title or claim to that credit don't lose out. They do lose out. The banks may lose out, or whoever's annuity funds will lose out, or whichever retirees that were depending on that, they may lose out. But the point is that a sovereign borrower may do this in order to take an ethical stand, and it's something that no other borrower has the power to do. So that would be the response that I would give. It's something that sovereigns can do, is to repudiate debt, which the British have never done with this. Let's see, payment for dead souls, overlapping types. Right. Okay. So these are 2 fascinating observations. Now, I hadn't actually thought of that question before, so that's very helpful to me. I know that the actual enumeration of the number of slaves on a plantation based on the triennial reports, as you mentioned, was extremely central to the way that the valuation was taking place. But that's where the dead souls appear often in the margins, or often as an addition to what was officially listed as the population for a plantation. So this was a way, certainly, of enhancing or supplementing the number. But that does leave the factual question of, was there a double dipping that was taking place? Was it possible for slave owners to both claim insurance on one hand and also get the additional compensation on the other? And I don't know that, but that would be very interesting to explore, how insurance was fitting into this story. And then in terms of Beauvoir's book, I would just say it's a tremendous book. So I'm ready to kind of really dive into it, but I think it has the key to seeing this, to really ferreting out what emancipation is really about, because this is one of her main interests, is to say, what was the problem that emancipation was actually trying to solve? Was it only the problem of how to end the atrocity of slavery, maybe partly, but there were many other interests that were at work, and she's interested in those many other interests, which I see that as a very valuable
and you'll have to be
contribution.
very quick with this one. I'm just being told there's a class to come in here in
Okay.
5 minutes. So,
dollar ratio. So very briefly, there is some relation because there were all kinds of calculations that were being made. But my one-liner would be that slave prices for these valuations were supposedly being based on averages in the slave market between 1828 and 1834, and they had some calculus that they were doing to claim not based on the actual production from the plantations, but based on the market price of slaves, which there would be some relation between those, of course, and that's how they were calculating these prices. There was some relation to these, but it wasn't a clear one.
okay, you have a quick question? That's the last question, quickly.
So what is your, in terms of reparations, what are you proposing? Because if you were to just give everybody $1 million, it really would make a difference. So I would think more in terms of the fact that, for example, we have a government making us truly free and truly independent of them, as opposed to just adding up numbers and putting some money in everybody's bank account. What is it you're proposing as reparations?
I think reparations is a project of repairing social relations, and the question is, what are the many different projects and initiatives that have to be put in place in order to repair social relations for black folk in the diaspora whose social relations have been generationally distorted or torn. And so that would involve education, that would involve health, that would involve access to social goods, that would involve opening up resources that are supposedly in some other nation, like in Britain or in France, opening up those resources for folks who are in the diaspora who share this common history. So I do see, in my understanding of reparations, it is about repair taking place at the interpersonal level, at the institutional level, at the governmental level, but fundamentally it is a repair to the disrepair of denial. I think that for me is the beginning, because once these governments stop the denial of the facts, then we can actually have a fluid and engaging conversation about what does repair look like. And the problem is that in some ways these metropolitan societies, they want to hear only the language of, oh, you want money in your pocket. Because that's an anti-relational discourse. That's, I'm giving you something that I will not have and then you will have, and then we have no connection. But that's replicating the way that in some ways the discourse has been structured. So how to not think in terms of anti-relation, but think in terms of ethical relation, I feel like that is the conversation for reparations.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually there are some brochures up here which set out what CARICOM is proposing in their 10-point action plan for reparatory justice. So take up one as you go out. I think it intersects with what Kris is saying. So Kris, Professor Manjapra, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. And as you go, though, there's another issue that is related to yours. What about all those planters who already got money for those enslaved people killed during wars of resistance? They all got money for loss, quote unquote, of property. How does that tie in with now this? It seems as if they are getting paid 3 times for the same person. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Kris,
Yes.
if there is no input of land,